Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tim. Today, we'll be doing a program about the Battle of the Passes with John Quarstein. Before we do that, of course, just a little housekeeping. Like always, we're going to have a Q&A section at the end. So go ahead and type your questions in to the chat box in the live chat, and we will do our best to answer them. Just want to let you know our next program will be next Friday, July 17th at noon. And that is going to be about the Battle of New Orleans, the capture of New Orleans. So that should be a good program. Also, we've got our blogs accompanying these. So we'll send a link in the description and the chat box below. And then lastly, just please share, like, subscribe. Your participation helps grow the channel and helps us create more content like this. So without further ado, we're going to pass it over to John.
Hello, this is, of course, John Quarstein. I'm Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum, and I'm pleased to come to you today to talk about the Battle of the Head of the Passes. Now, this is not much of a battle, but it does feature that hellish machine known as the CSS Manassas. And at the beginning of the Civil War, you have to realize that the Secretary of Navy for the Confederacy, Stephen Russell Mallory, was really thinking forward about the need for ironclads. He had been chairman of the Senate's Committee on Naval Affairs. He had paid attention to the Crimean War and the development of ironclads in Europe. Consequently, he advocated at the very beginning, even before the war began, the need for ironclads. Now, I have to tell you, the first government project to build an ironclad will actually be the conversion of the CSS Virginia or the conversion of the USS Merrimack into the CSS Virginia. That doesn't start really in earnest until May of '61. However, even before then, a man known as Captain John Stevenson, who was a New Orleans commissioning agent and actually was secretary of the New Orleans Pilots Benevolent Association. Now, he went to meet with Jefferson Davis when the capital was still in Montgomery, Alabama, and said, I want a letter of marque because I want to build a privateer that as he tells Davis, is comparatively safe against the heaviest guns afloat, and by preparing bow in particular manner, rendered them capable of sinking by collision the heaviest vessels ever built. Davis sends holy water on the project, and so Stevenson comes back down to New Orleans. He raises by subscription $100,000. And now what's he going to do? Well, he already has the privateer known as the CSS Ivy. And the Ivy is operating in the Gulf of Mexico. And immediately it's going to capture a heavy tug known as the Enoch train. And what makes the Enoch train so good is that it is also an icebreaker. So it has a built-up bow, and that built-up bow is going to come into very excellent service. So what they do is they take the Enoch train up to New Orleans. Outside of New Orleans, in Algiers, they will convert the ship into an ironclad by cutting it all down to the main deck, and then they build a shield, a convex shield, as you can see in this picture, that was of 16 inches of oak and topped by 1.25 inches of iron plate. The convex design was meant for shot to bounce off the ironclad. And so the ship has gotten a strengthened bow so that it has a cast iron ram, which no one can see, but it's right at the bow of the vessel. And it also is mounted with, and you can see in this picture, the little gun position. Originally, that was a 64-pounder gun. Eventually, they'll change it to a banded rifle, as you can see. Now, this is actually a picture of the gun on the teaser, but that's a 32-pounder that the Confederates then took and banded it and then rifled the barrel so that they could get greater range. And the big trouble with this gun, so the 32-pounder will be on the ship when it goes into action. The problem with the gun is it's difficult to reload, even though it has a port shutter. There's not a lot of room in the ship to move. Number one, if you want to fire your gun, you actually have to point the ship at your target. So its real purpose was, as you're ramming, you get to fire a shot into the right into the enemy's ship. So that makes it just outstanding. Basically, as Stevenson finishes the ship on July 21st, 1861, just think that, July 21, 1861. This is the first Confederate ironclad. Actually, it's the first ironclad of the entire Civil War. Now, when it is actually launched on September 12th, certain man, and here he is, Commander George Hollins. And George Hollins is really a dynamic officer. He had already been involved with the capture of the St. Nicholas, which was a bold effort to capture Union ships on the Chesapeake Bay. He then gets assigned to New Orleans as station commander, and he's putting together this small little fleet. However, he knows that he has a great deal of issues because the Union fleet is beginning to arrive outside of the what is called the three passes that come down. And so he knew he had to strengthen his little fleet because he has ships like the CSS Calhoun, the CSS Jackson, the Pickens, the Tuscarora. He also has the Ivy and the McRae. Now, the McRae actually used to be the Marquis de La Habana, and that ship was actually fought during the Battle of Anton Lizardo, and I might get to that in one future program, in 1860 during the Mexican Reform War, and the U.S. Navy was down there. So anyway, it gets taken to New Orleans. Hollins takes it over, and so it's his most powerful gun. Now, the big thing is that Hollins realizes that he's got to protect what is known as, that's the McRae right there. And this is a picture of the passes. Now, the Mississippi Delta, yes, is going to come down, and you're going to have the Southwest Pass, the South Pass, and the Pass de l'Autry. I don't speak French, so I think that's close enough. They all come together at that one point, and that is what is known as the head of the passes. So the Federal ships start arriving off the Delta. The first one to arrive was the USS Brooklyn. Then the side paddle wheeler Powhatan arrives. Steam crew frigates, the Niagara and the Minnesota, also arrive. And so they block each one of these passes. The squadron is commanded by William McKean, who's actually a cousin to Franklin Buchanan, believe it or not. And as he received more reinforcements, he is going to, actually, here's a picture of the Brooklyn, and there's a picture of McKean. And so he sends a force up to the head of the passes, which is going to be commanded by Captain John Pope. Now, John Pope is been in the Navy since 1816. He is a major veteran of, the Mexican War, the Barbary Coast Wars, and he has a small flotilla, which consists of the screw sloop Richmond, also, and that mounts 14 9-inch Dahlgren guns. Those guns can blow anything that Hollins has out of the water. So as a result of this, he will anchor the Richmond, and it's supported also by the sailing sloops, the Vincennes of 18 guns, the Preble of 16 guns, and then also the side-wheeler gunboat, the Water Witch, with 10 guns. The Water Witch was really there to tow those sloops into action. Now, once Hollins finds out that the Federals are at the head of the passes, this just won't do for him. And so on October 9, now I got to tell you this, the Union forces start to arrive at the end of September. Hollins finds out, he brings his squadron down to Fort Jackson, and from there he sends the CSS Ivy that has that rifled gun. He's going to send the Ivy down to the head of the passes. Now, because he has a rifled gun, that means that he has greater range than does the Federals. So the Ivy comes down and sends shots at the Richmond, the Preble, and the Vincennes. In fact, this upsets Pope, and it really unnerved him. He asked to abandon his position. However, they said, nope, you got to stay there. He thought that it was impossible to hold his position because of the better gun that the Ivy has. But it was such a long range, the shot was not effective. So what Hollins does is he will take over the Manassas from Stevenson. Stevenson's crying, how can you take my ship? And actually, they come alongside, and Lieutenant Alexander Warley the crew members of the privateer Manassas say, you come here, we're going to kill you. And Warley goes up the ladder that goes up the deck, and with his gun and his cutlass, and they scatter, right? And so Warley officially takes over the ship. It's going to be commissioned on October 10th. The next morning, Hollins decides to make his assault. And this is really amazing because the night, according to Hollins, was very dark. The moon had set and the mist hanging low over the river. This was perfect for Hollins' preemptive attack. His vessels were almost invisible in the eerie gloom as they came down the river. In the lead was the Manassas, followed by 3 chained together fire rafts. And so followed that is going to be Hollins's gunboats. And so all of a sudden we have a situation that is really going to shock Pope and his squadron. So about 4:40 a.m., the Richmond was in process of loading coal from the schooner Joseph H. Toone when a lookout from the Preble shouted, "Ahoy, there's a boat coming down on your port bow." The noise of the coaling masked the sound of the warning when suddenly the Manassas will peer out of the mist. I have to tell you, she puts on all combustibles they can to pick up speed, because this ship, its engines really should have been on a scrap heap. That's how bad they are. The Manassas could make 4 to 6 knots. No one knows exactly how fast it went. However, by pouring on cotton waste, extra pine knots, so forth, you fire up your engine so you produce more steam, and you get to, remember, this is a screw ironclad, so it's got a screw engine. So that makes it rush at the Richmond. Sparks fly out of the ship's smokestack, and oh my gosh, the ironclad crashed into the Richmond. However, her forward motion is going to be limited by the what's called the Toone, because the Toone is right next to the Richmond, and so part of the impact of the Manassas is taken by the Toone. The Manassas then gets squeezed in between the Richmond and the coaling schooner. You can't depress your guns low enough on the Richmond to fire at that turtle or the whale. Some people called it, looked like a whale. And so all of a sudden the lines parted, the tomb floats away, and the Manassas. Now I want to tell you, when the Manassas rammed the Richmond, she caused a leak in the Richmond. However, actually the Manassas has more damage. Number one, its ram was lost, was knocked off. And I think also the hull of the Manassas buckled, causing yet another leak. One of the engines were knocked off of its mount as a result of the collision. And so with one engine, the Manassas can barely limp over to the shore. But she's supposed to set off flares to tell the other ships to release the fire rafts. These 3 fire rafts are chained together. So inside the Manassas, they get the flares ready. However, one of the flares accidentally goes off inside the Manassas. It's almost like a comedy. The flare bounces around inside the iron vessel. However, they then shoot off the other flares, and these rockets will actually let the Confederates to release these fire rafts. Now you can imagine this eerie scene, misty, and the fire rafts are burning, coming right after wooden ships. So in all this confusion, the Richmond and the Preble fire at the ram, Manassas, but because of the ship's low profile, they overshot the Manassas. We don't know whether a shot from the Richmond knocks over the Manassas' smokestack or whether it was knocked over by the collision. But what that does is send fumes down into the main deck of the Manassas. So the men are choking from the fumes, and the Manassas then begins to struggle its way up river. Now, this is a picture, of course, of the Vincennes. Now, as soon as all this happened, with these fire rafts coming down the river, Pope will panic. And he panics in a way that he orders his ships to slip their cables, cut their anchors, and retreat down the Southwest Pass. Now, the Water Witch would be the last to leave. The tide is going out, so these boats come down the Southwest Pass, and at the end, where the Southwest Pass joins the Gulf of Mexico, believe it or not, there's a bar. And that bar at low tide is going to actually, this is the Water Witch right here, the tide will expose part of the bar, and the Richmond and Vincennes run aground. Only the Preble reached the safety of the Gulf of Mexico. At daylight, Hollins squadron goes down the head of the pass, or Southwest Pass, and they will begin to bombard the grounded, hapless warships. The commander of the Vincennes misread a signal from Captain Pope, and which he thought said ordered the ships to be abandoned. Oh my gosh, this is horror, because by abandoning your ship, you then also put a fuse to the magazine, and when the crew of the Vincennes makes it over to the Richmond, Pope says, oh, no, you're supposed to get underway. So they go back to the Vincennes, and they cut the fuse, and somehow the ship is revitalized by the return of its crew. Hollins doesn't know this is going on. And so he missed an opportunity to capture the Vincennes. And eventually he'll break off action about 9 o'clock and will actually go back. He breaks off action because he's low on ammunition. The Manassas is damaged, and he's low on fuel. So he has to go back to Fort Jackson. He takes with him the what is known as the Toon, the Joseph Toon, the coaling schooner that has 15 tons of coal on it. So that's good for the Confederates. So they capture one ship. However, this escape of the Union fleet was considered very cowardly. In fact, the action is called Pope's Run, believe it or not. And Pope's Run is not a very nice way of talking about Captain Pope. You have to realize, he is a longstanding veteran of over 40 years of naval service. Actually, it's 45 years of naval service. And it's going to be called, Pope's Run is going to be called a ridiculous affair. Now, let me just tell you, the Confederates, when the Manassas gets back to Fort Jackson and back to New Orleans, it is lauded, and the people line the riverbank cheering. And that day, October 11th, 1861, that dreaded disease that is going to infiltrate both sides of the Civil War, ram fever, was born. So the first Ironclad does the first ramming of a wooden ship, which is showing the transition of naval warfare. Now, Pope will later report, everyone is in dread of that infernal ram. Flag Officer McKean reported, the more I hear and learn of the facts, the more disgraceful it does appear. The ridiculous Union actions during the engagement resulted in Pope's resignation due to health reasons. And shortly thereafter, they will assign David Glasgow Farragut to take command of what they named the West Coast or the West Gulf Coast Blockading Squadron. And Pope will actually be on reserve. He actually gets promoted to Rear Admiral, believe it or not, in 1862, but he just does administrative work. That's probably what he was best at anyway. But at the beginning of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, I guess I made a mistake here. Okay, so I guess you guys got to see all these pictures. If not, that's the Water Witch. There's the Vincennes. There is this USS Richmond. There is the Richmond, and you can see the Preble to the left and the Vincennes to the right, and you can see the fire rafts coming down river. Now, what happens to those fire rafts? They run aground on the shoal, so they have no effect, but they rattle Pope's nerves, right? The ramming of the Manassas, the better guns on the Confederate ships will make him do what we call Pope's Run. There is Commodore John Pope, as he will be called. This is William McKean, of course, cousin to Confederate Admiral Franklin Buchanan. This is the USS Brooklyn that begins the blockade of the passes. So we also have, you can see how the passes work. The Southwest Pass is to the left. The South Pass is in the middle. The Pass d'Autre is to the right. Those are the main ways you get into the Mississippi. There are bars at the head of each of them, so this will make it difficult for Union ships to actually get over the bar to be able to have action. This is the McRae, which I talked about earlier, and this is Hollins. He's got this determined look, and he was so determined. Actually, despite his aggressiveness, he gets reassigned to Richmond because people are tired of him, asking for more support and, getting ironclads done and so forth. This is a 6.4-inch rifled banded 32-pounder. So this would be called a banded 32-pounder. You can see the band. This banding was developed by John Mercer Brooke and Archibald Fairfax, who was Chief Ordnance Officer at Gosport Navy Yard. So the Confederates are trying to do, and here is the Manassas. So what have we learned today? Well, let me just tell you, we've learned that, number one, by sloping your sides and having an iron protected surface, you were protected. However, a well-aimed shot would break through 1.25 inches of iron with 11-inch Dahlgren with pretty much ease. We know that this ship, the Manassas, is the first ironclad of the Civil War. It has one gun. However, the ship has to turn itself to point the gun. Really, the purpose was as you ram, you fired your gun. That's exactly what the CSS Virginia did when she rammed the USS Cumberland in Hampton Roads on March 8th, 1862. Now, so the Manassas proves the power of a ram, proves the power of iron over wood, and so we now are setting the stage for the rush to build ironclads by both the North and the South. And so if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. I don't see any in my share box.
Yeah, we got just a couple quick ones here.
Oh, great.
So one was someone was asking, so did the battle basically last about 5 hours?
Yes, roughly 5 hours, until around 10 o'clock in the morning. So it goes from little before 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. So that, if I do my math right, that's 5 hours. Much of it is the movement of the Union ships down the Southwest Pass. And when those ships run aground, had the Manassas still been operational, that they would have not been able to, the Manassas could have really come close and done some significant damage to the Vincennes and the Richmond. But Manassas is not a good design. So anyway, what's the next one, Tim?
Let's see here. Did they fire shell or did they fire shot?
Well, they fired shell. And shells had been introduced to naval warfare in the 1820s. It really was brought to the forefront during John Dahlgren's work as chief of the Ordnance Bureau. He actually creates it. He designs the Dahlgren shell gun, and he recreates it in 9-inch, 11-inch. He actually tries to do a 13-inch, but it doesn't work well because you can't. You have to do a different casting method to make these larger guns, but he does successfully do the 15-inch guns. Now, these shell guns, the Manassas comes out of nowhere. No one knows, the Federals don't know exists at this time until October 11th. And so they're not ready for that type of vessel. The Manassas, with a 32-pounder banded gun, could fire solid shot and shell. But since she was going after wooden ships, she would have been firing shells, as would have the Confederate squadron. Because shells are very deadly to wooden ships, as we know from other parts of the Civil War. Okay.
Great. So someone here is just asking to look at the map again, which I'm sharing currently, so you don't have to worry about that. But our next question was, what became of the CSS Manassas subsequently?
Oh my gosh, that you get to learn that next Friday. Okay, because the Manassas is the only truly operational ironclad defending at Fort Jackson, Fort St. Philip. So I'm going to talk about the other Confederate ironclads under construction, that they weren't quite ready, which is because of transportation and other reasons. The ship will actually be run aground, and as during the passing of the forts, Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson. And when the Manassas comes down, she tries to ram the Hartford, tries to ram the Brooklyn, actually rams the Mississippi, but George Dewey at the helm will turn his ship very rapidly, and so it just cuts along the side, cutting into the wood for about 40 feet down the length of the Manassas, so that you could see the copper bolts, and that was pretty scary. However, Farragut shouts, take care of that rascally rebel ram, and so the Mississippi will turn on a dime because it's a side wheeler and go after it. The Manassas will be forced to run aground, and Dewey will say, we left her with new portholes. In other words, they fired shot into her. She catches fire. The Warley and his men escape, and the ship floats downriver and explodes below Fort Jackson near the mortar fleet. So that's what happens to the Manassas. It will go and be repaired after the Battle of the Passes, and will be operational again in January of 1862. Okay, so okay, anything else?
Let's see here. Who was Enoch Train?
Who was Enoch Train? I have looked to find out, and I couldn't find out who he was. There's two different possibilities. So he was not captain of the ship. I know that. Believe it or not, I don't have a proper answer for you on that one. And maybe I just need to do more research. So any other questions?
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Oh my gosh, Jim.
So this is kind of related to
yes,
what we were talking about before we started, the turtle ship, the Korean turtle ship. So did the Confederates or did anyone in America know about the Korean turtle ship when they built the Manassas?
No, they did not. Remember, Japan is just open to the world in the 1850s. So this Korean ship is an unknown thing. If you look at the construction, it's mostly wood, but the convex top of the turtle ship is going to have iron shields that are 1 inch thick. And if you look closely, you can see the spears on top of them. So in the 1591 through 93, that the turtle ship will turn back a major Japanese invasion of the Korean Peninsula, all because they intersect new technology, right? And this is a very scary type of ship. No gun ports. It's motive power, our oars, of course. But it, with just a few of these ships, they're able to turn back a much larger Japanese fleet. In fact, I'll do a program one of these days just about the turtle ships. It's amazing. We in America didn't know about the turtle ships until the Korean War. And that's when a naval officer learns about it, and he writes an article for the U.S. Navy Naval Institute and their Proceedings magazine, and way back in the 50s. And it's an amazing article to read, and it's amazing that the story goes unknown for so long, and yet the very design of the Manassas, as we can see by this picture, is going to be really similar to the turtle ship. This is not a broadside ship. It is a ram. The gun is, some people call it useless, but I understand why it is mounted and how it could be used. So anyway, any other questions? Okay.
One last one.
Oh, great.
So it says here, the picture shows almost no draft. Could the Manassas run in the ocean?
On a calm day, I'd go out in the Gulf, but this ship has a draft of 13 feet. So technically, she can get over the bar fairly easily. And the Enoch Train was an ocean-going tug. So technically, she could go out to sea. But when she's cut down and has this convex shield put over her, that means in a 15 to 20 knot wind, the waves are going to crash over the boat, are going to go down the hatches, and voila, the ship is going to sink. So it is really for operations on the Mississippi River.
All right, well, that's about all the questions we have for today.
Well, great. And next week, I'll tell you who Enoch Train is. I'm going to have to do some research, but I never been asked that question. I never thought about it before. I find myself very much amiss, and I hope you forgive me for my lack of knowledge on that topic, but I will fix that very quickly. And I want to thank you all for being part of the Zoom lecture series that we do from the Mariners Museum. This is how we really reach out about one of our major stories, and that is, the development of ironclads during the Civil War, because the Mariners Museum features the USS Monitor and its turret engines. So the Mariners Museum is much more than just the Monitor, I have to tell you. So whenever we're able to reopen, I hope you'll visit. I'm going to continue doing these programs during this plague year. I reread Daniel Defoe's Diary of a Plague Year about a month ago, and I'm just overtaken by it all. But nevertheless, I wish you all well. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for in supporting the Mariners Museum and Park here in Newport News, Virginia. Thank you.